We're joined now by Sam Chester, analyst at asset management firm KCPS Clarity. Sam, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so, I mean, Tnuva essentially is an Israeli icon. It's quintessentially Israeli. There are Israeli nursery rhymes about Tnuva. Is that the reason why the responses have been as heated as they were?
I think the response owes itself both to the history of Tnuva. 80-year-old company, owns 7 of the 10 most popular food products in the Israeli market, but also, as the report mentioned, in 2011, the social street protests that took over Israel, they were prompted by the price of cottage cheese which is owned by Tnuva. So both historically and also very recently with consumer prices, Tnuva has been at the center of the storm in Israel.
Okay. And why is China so interested in a small Israeli dairy company? I mean, what is in it for China?
I think it's a good question. It's something that people are overlooking. And if I can, I would compare it to the previous owners who sold to China, Apex, private equity based in London, and Bright Food, the Chinese company. And I think it's important because there's something that people often overlook, which is as follows. Apex Partners, the private equity firm that sold its stake to the Chinese company, they're a private equity firm. Their goal when they invested in Tnuva in 2007 was buy low, sell high. As a result, as the news reports have shown, they were looking to raise the prices of cheese, of dairy in Israel so that they could sell Tnuva to a customer like the Chinese company and make a profit. Bright Food, on the other hand, the Chinese company, is an entirely different beast. They're investing in an Israeli dairy firm for strategic reasons. If you look at the Chinese dairy market, dairy is expected in milk in China to become the largest market in the world by 2016. Bright Food, as a major Chinese company, wants a piece of that.
It's a little ironic. I mean, the Chinese buying milk. I mean, milk is not necessarily traditionally something that's drunk so much in China.
No, for sure. One thing you see is as Chinese consumers' income goes up, they're buying more consumer demands, and at the same time, you may remember in 2009, there was a food scandal in China when milk powder, they were all seen to be tainted. As a result, Chinese consumers are looking more and more for foreign brands. As a result, Chinese dairy companies, including Bright Food, which is one of the largest players in China, have been making foreign acquisitions. And one point I would add, because this is important in this debate to look at, is Tnuva is not the first foreign dairy company that has been purchased by the Chinese. Bright Food itself has bought a dairy company in 2010 in New Zealand. In 2011, they bought a dairy company in Australia. Okay. And just in the past year, they bought a large food companies, both in England and also in France. So this is part of a larger global trend.
Okay. And I mean, when you look at it really, I mean, essentially this company was already foreign owned. The British owned it. Is there really a difference between whether the British own it or the Chinese own it?
For sure. I think looking at the control issue is very interesting. You saw reports from Israeli politicians in the last few days, including the head of one of the major Israeli parties, said, what kind of sane country sells out its food security to the Chinese? Now, I think some of those sort of exaggerated critiques overlook the following 2 facts. First of all, nothing of Tnuva's, none of the dairy kibbutzim are going to actually be moved to China. The cows are staying in Israel. So in terms of the basic products, they're all still staying in Israel. The management's going to stay here. The production is all going to stay here. But more importantly than that, I think something that's overlooked is that the Chinese company, if you look at the Chinese company, they've been making purchases elsewhere, and in the purchases they've made elsewhere, nothing has changed for the worse. And in the control issue in particular, you haven't seen that a Chinese ownership of a foreign company has had a dramatic negative effect. The best example, 6 months ago, Smithfield, which is 40% of the livestock market in the US, was purchased by a Chinese company. At the time, US politicians said exactly the same thing that Israeli politicians are saying now. And yet the deal was reviewed, it was approved, and so far its stock is doing well. So you could look at examples in the US, you can look at examples in New Zealand, you can look at examples in Australia.
So ultimately, it really just comes down to the fact that it's sort of like American selling Ford, so to speak. I mean, like it's just this company that is so rooted into Israeli culture, so to speak. I mean, the land of milk and honey, that it becomes such a crucial issue for them.
I think it's a great point. I think people outside of Israel have a hard time looking at Tnuva and they say, what is Tnuva? And if you understand Tnuva as a company like Ford, as an icon to the Israeli public, you understand why politicians and why consumers in Israel may be concerned. But if you look at the real issues, consumer price in Israel of dairy has been price controlled largely since 2011 by the Israeli government. That's unlikely to change. Again, going back to what I said earlier, a private equity firm has a reason to want to raise prices and make a quick sell.
Right.
A food conglomerate like the Chinese company has much less of an incentive to do so. Their incentive, why did they buy Tnuva in the first place? The tech, Israeli dairy industry is considered the leader in the world in terms of producing the most milk from cows. The tech transfer, and also Chinese breadfruit is speaking of perhaps bringing export of Israeli dairy to China. Something like that would be tremendous in terms of the larger issue of Chinese-Israel business
Of course,
ties.
it's right. In terms of the larger issue, in terms of Chinese-Israel business, I mean, there's a shift of course, Israeli business going towards China.
Oh, for sure. You look at investment numbers from China coming into Israel in the last few years, huge numbers. It's very exciting times.
All right. Well, Sam Chester from KCPS, thank you very much for joining us. That takes us to the end of this edition. I'm Benjamin Chalafars. Join us again tomorrow for more on the economy.